I'm certainly glad to be here because it concerns you most of all as Germans, the topic of my talk this evening. I'm aware that the Holocaust has received a lot of attention these days.
Could you be a bit louder, please, if you can?
Yes, indeed. I'm aware that the Holocaust has received a lot of attention these last few years. My subject is not the Holocaust itself, but the reason of that phenomenon itself. It's a fairly long paper. It's really designed for an academic audience, which I may or may not have at the University of Toronto. But I hope it will be interesting to you and not too shocking. I wish to bring to your attention this evening the social and political views of Eugen Duehring, an intellectual whose work has been largely neglected throughout this century, even though his German Socialism was a remarkably original effort to combat the liberal capitalistic and Marxist socialist systems that were prevalent in Germany at the turn of the century. In fact, Duehring's perceptive analyses of society, politics, economics, and culture in his various works constitute a unique corpus in the history of ideas, since they are almost all of them conducted from a consistent standpoint of anti-Judaism. And his discussion of the Jewish question per se, in the Judenfrage, which was first published in 1881, remains one of the earliest, most scholarly, and most prophetic accounts of the insidious menace to European culture that is represented by the Jewish race. Eugen Duehring was born in Berlin, the son of a Prussian bureaucrat, and studied law, philosophy, and political economy at the University of Berlin. Although he began his career by practicing law, he was forced to give up this profession at the age of 28, when he was blinded through a congenital defect. Duehring took his doctorate in 1861 at the University of Berlin, and in 1963 he became university lecturer in philosophy and national economy. His earliest published works were national economic ones, influenced by his reading of the German-American economist Friedrich List and the American Henry Charles Carey, who were both in favor of organic economics with a strong emphasis on protectionism and national interest. Already, the ethical orientation of his economic studies was revealed in his early publication of a work entitled Der Welt des Lebens. Two further philosophical publications, Natürliche Dialektik and Kritische Geschichte der Philosophie, were followed by yet other works on national economy. A fuller elaboration of his philosophical system was finally presented in the Cursus der Philosophie, published in Leipzig in 1875. While Duehring's lectures were very successful, he adopted from the start a critical attitude to the university and its institutions, and the improbability of his acquiring a professorship as a result of this conflict only sharpened his attacks. Finally, in 1877, under the pressure created by his attacks of the German universities and their professors, as well as those on Helmholtz, Duehring was removed from the university. This dismissal was later attributed by him to the machination of the Jewish elements in the university and of their influential agents in the press. His later publications as a private scholar, including two works on literature, Die Überschätzung Lessings und dessen Anwaltschaft für die Juden and Die Größen der modernen Literatur, as well as die Judenfrage, represent his comprehensive treatment of the problem of Jewish involvement in European society. His major interest in social and political economy, however, was reinforced in his last works, a second edition of Kapital und Arbeit and Soziale Rettung, published in Leipzig in 1907, which are consolidations of his economic and philosophic positions. Duehring battled for reform in all fields of life, being exceptionally qualified to comment in an expert way on most of them. And it must be noted that while the Jewish mentality is emphatically located as the root of the evil of society in his later works, his anti-Judaism was evident long before his dismissal from the university in his earliest economic and philosophical works. His social ideal was based on a moral cultivation of the individual spirit, which would liberate the personality from all external and internal hindrances and permit it to form a vital culture. To this end, Duehring formed a journal called Der Personalist und Emanzipator in 1899, designed to strengthen the human individual spirit in its opposition to the external powers of nature, as well as to those of exploitative social groups especially the Jews. Unlike most of the other philosophical anti-Semites, such as Fichte and Schopenhauer and Chamberlain, Dühring was not an idealist, but a realist. He dismissed metaphysics as being one of the source of the superstitious errors of mankind, and his mathematical denial of infinity was reflected in his stern view of human life as being empirically and socially determined. However, even in this realism, Dühring retained a vestige of metaphysicalism, since he posited beyond all temporality a primordial being from which the universe evolves. Only for human beings in their terrestrial condition, the actually present is far more valuable than speculations regarding the ultimate source of reality. What takes the place of metaphysical questions in Dühring's work is the Socratian imperative of morality. For all life, while materially manifested, is informed with vitality and activity, categories which cannot be reduced to matter. Man-made institutions like religion are to be removed only because they are invariably encrusted with superstitions and act as a stumbling block to the full realization of the human personality. In economics, the Marxist view of class warfare is to be similarly considered as a dangerous superstition, which obscures in convoluted dialectic the real sympathy that should and could exist between employers and workers, and which alone forms the basis of a healthy social ethos. In this, Dühring was one with the other German socialists, including Oswald Spengler in his Preußentum und Sozialismus, and Werner Sombart in his Deutscher Sozialismus, who paved the way for National Socialism. Like the anti-democratic thinkers of the Weimar Republic, both conservative and socialist, Dühring considered parliamentarism as an outmoded and dangerous system. The English Parliament he characterized as a Repräsentation des Raub- und Raffsystems, since the Tory and Whig parties were nothing but the representatives of belligerent and colonial robbery and capitalistic commercial rapacity. The French Parliament was even more basely bourgeois in its representation of financial and stock exchange interests. In Germany, parliamentarism receives its hateful stamp from the Willen-Junkerische und Hebräisch-Bourgeoisie Prozentum angebliche Sozialdemokratie, in which one cannot speak of real rejection of slavery, but which on the contrary uses the traditional familiarity of the masses to slavery to subject them to a party despotism and an exploitation by the parties. Dühring maintained that parliamentary legislation must be effectively curtailed in its attacks on the workers and their living conditions. Rather, he proposed free associations between the concerned parties that resemble economic communes and corporations. Unlike Marx, Dühring did not consider the reformation of social relations as something that will arise through dialectical necessity from the increasing weakness of the working classes in an industrial society, for this is tantamount to expecting a miracle from the exploitative tendencies of the capitalists. On the other hand, the workers themselves must strive to strengthen themselves through coalitions so as to achieve self-sufficiency. The coalitions or communes formed by workers will guarantee the access of all to property and means of production. The focus is shifted away from the concept of personal property altogether to relations of the right of use of property according to personal capacity. The precondition for the success of such workers' coalitions, however, is the direction of all their efforts to the interests of the whole, of the public as a totality, and this can be effected perfectly only when the state enters in their support. The state must act as the mediator between the several socio-economic interests of the population, especially since the latter cannot be adequately represented by political parties, which are not truly democratic at all, but oligarchic groupings, in which a considerable part of the people has a place only as a ruled and mostly anonymous mass. The leadership of the state can be accomplished only by the prevalence of another sense than that of profit-making, such as is directive in the British political economy and in that of its followers on the continent. The prime consideration of the state must be the totality of the aspirations of the people. Dühring's economics, therefore, is nation-bound and not an international economic one. The remedy of the deplorable situation that prevails in the present can be accomplished only when society is first revolutionized on an anti-egoistic basis. In his discussion of the Jewish question, Dühring makes clear that this revolution may be identified with the revolution against the Jews as the racial embodiment of self-interest, and points out that, and I quote him, "In the country of origin of the French Revolution, in Judaized France, one hears the declaration that the next revolution will be won against the Jews." The fact that parliamentarianism has increasingly been dominated by the influence of the Jews and the socialistic proletariat, that is, of those racial and social elements which are the most egoistic, leads Dühring to call for the overcoming of the Jewish progress and Juncker reaction, which represents the system of avarice and rapacity. This can be accomplished only by a transitional dictatorship, which gives political expression to the anger of the people. Dühring conceives of the bearer of such a dictatorship as an intellectually and morally outstanding person, whose power is consolidated by armed force and by an elite of like-minded persons filled with the same sense of social justice. The task of this regime would be to create a fertile ground for true justice, so that even after its passing, the society may continue to develop itself in future through its purified spirit and will. Thus, although Dühring began as a student of socialistic doctrines, he later rejected all forms of collectivism and maintained that true progress proceeds only from individual, powerful personalities. Even where groups seem to be the bearers of creative activities, in the final analysis, it is individuals at the head of those organizations in whom the entire association achieves its characteristic effect. The state as an association itself is to be valued mainly as a check on the various economic associations active in society, so that none exploits or damages the other. Dühring's increasing reliance on the individual personality caused him in his later years to stress the classification of society according to property and interest, as a result of the differences of opportunities for development of personal capacity and character, which are propagated through the generations by tradition and inheritance. Unlike the socialist, Dühring considered all property related to personal accomplishment as vigorously to be defended against the acquisitive grasp of socialistic measures. Only one sort of differentiation is to be rejected, that based on violence, and he means always violence not just physical but also psychological. All Marxist denials of social classifications are thus utopian, since a conflict of interests is indivisibly linked to the natural differences between man and man. The Jewish socialist propaganda of class warfare is only a result of the introduction of injustice into these natural differences. This injustice is concocted in the final analysis not from economic sentiments, but from the original opposition between a powerful warrior nobility and a powerless slave group, such as the Jews themselves have always been. It is not surprising that the Jewish economy transvalues economics through the subordination of the higher to the lower aspirations of the people. The vital importance of the self-emancipation of the individual is reinforced in Dühring's doctrine of morality freed from all superstitious religion. Considering the Judaic concept of Yahweh as that of a god of transcendental terrorism, Dühring sought to replace the Judeo-Christian ethos by a new social and economic feeling for justice. This entails the rejection, first of all sorts of exploitation, whereby the individual is exposed to harm from the robber types of the society. The latter are directed by the desire for increasing individual profit, that is, by the cultivation of a ruthless egoism. The true concept of justice, therefore, depends on the substitution of egoism by a radical anti-egoism. Only on the ground of this sort of justice can a healthy society and culture develop, a social order in which entire members would be bound by legal interests and would not aim at basing their own existence and power on the reduction and destruction of other lives. The reform of social justice, however, does not mean the simplistic socialistic demand of equality for all, since rewards are always directly related to performances. What is to be avoided at all costs, however, is the unjust encroachments on personal freedom and integrity which represent the mastery of the exploitative members of the present society. The reform of the intellectually motivated will to a better and nobler personal disposition will, in its anti-egoism, be naturally restrained in its interpersonal dealings and its participation in the nexus of economic interests. Thus the major representatives of the exploitative economy are the newly emancipated Jews, Dühring never once doubted. In the Kritische Geschichte der Nationalökonomie und des Sozialismus, Dühring observes of the commercial ethos of the present that it denies in no way its Semitic relationship, and as clear as the discernment is which we have to bring to the settling of the question of egoism, we cannot in the first place attribute an understanding of this to those who, by virtue of their unchangeable egoism, seem to have no organ for scientific reasons and nobler motives in this direction. This theoretical obtuseness of the Jews is an intellectual fortification behind which has been entrenched up to now the apotheosis of egoism, the glorification of the art of cheating, and in general the entire celebration of the handsome stratagem of cunning exploitation. In his Cursus de Philosophia, Dühring reiterates the commercial and financial role appropriated everywhere by the Jews after the fall of their own state and their parasitical infiltration into other nations. The historically attested cruelty and crass egoism of the Jews has thus seeped into the public through the press and even the legislation, which have been increasingly dominated by them. Indeed, he says, even parts of science, which are especially ventured into by the Jews on account of their exclusion from others, already reveal in many ways the stamp of the new form of business directed to profit. At first, agreeing to a subordinate position in exchange for the privilege of making money through underhand means, and then gradually currying favour with the power holders through their increasing financial advantages, the Jews have inexorably developed a mastery in their host societies. And I quote him, "To be a slave or to make slaves, that is the alternative of the peoples disposed to lack of freedom." The slave form of religion is thus, not surprisingly, the characteristic and influential contribution of the Jews to intellectual history. At the time of writing this work on philosophy, Dühring still believed that socialism itself would be sufficient to counter the egoistic system of the Jews, since it is based on the organic sensibility of the people, which itself is radically opposed to the alien character of the exploitative Jewry. In fact, Dühring still hoped that when society removed the supports for the material egoism and exploitative activity of the Jews, the latter would be forced to live on their own work and not parasitically on that of others. Moreover, he thought that since his form of socialism would guarantee the economic independence of women as well as men, the former, that's women, would not enter into marriages of economic convenience with Jewish men anymore, since according to Dühring's belief, there could be no personal inclination thereto. That was a century ago. It's different now, I'm sure. The removal of opportunities for the exploitative activity of the Jews would at the same time make possible in the long run what he thought would be a gradual improvement of the ways of thought and feeling of the Jews and equip them for functions freed of egoism. This generous optimism of 1875 was, however, soon replaced by a more realistic understanding of the impossibility of the ethical improvement of the Jews. This is evidenced in the changes he made to the several editions of Die Judenfrage, especially with regard to the conclusion of the work. Dühring's increasing concentration on the Jewish problem since the first publication of Die Judenfrage in 1881 led to an increasing annoyance with the destructive alien element in European society, until in the final editions of Die Judenfrage he clearly maintained that since the Jewish character was an unchangeable one, the only means that would be effective against them would have to be of a terroristic nature. In the last edition of this work, published in 1901, Dühring even suggested that all the specific social and political remedies proposed by him against the Jewish evil in the early editions were bound to be inadequate in the long run, and must necessarily be reinforced by stronger means which do not permit the possibility of Jewish existence within the European communities any longer. As he explained in Sache, Leben und Feinde, which is his autobiography, the Jewish mentality is a criminal one, and its effect on the rest of society is that, and I quote him, "the corruption of the senses and the spirit comes first, and the lowering of the field for justice paves the way for the material ravaging and devouring." For this reason, the answer to the Jewish question belongs not merely to economics, but in general to life and to existence in all contexts. He now considered the Jewish question not merely in racial terms, but in terms of the question of estates, especially those bearing arms and those that are deprived of them. This included the Junkers as a target of Dühring's criticism, since they represented a segment of the exploitative population that would naturally have to be overcome. And I quote him, "Junker and priest, Jew and bourgeois, were to be analyzed from different viewpoints, but still in a similar way. Crime has no right to existence and must be destroyed in its embodiments. That is the axiom from which I start everywhere, thus even in the questions of race and estate." Dühring's final effort, therefore, was to raise his reformatory idea to the status of a world historical principle and to make a just war against the misformed up to the roots of their nature. The case of the Jews, however, was the most serious, since it revolved on what he calls an original natural defect and criminal natural creatures. The Jewish emancipation is meaningless, since the Jews will never be free. For, and I quote him, a true emancipation worthy of the name is accomplished only where the personal freedom and integrity is established and secured basically, and in all contexts, but especially in the individual. One of the most important contributions of Dühring's work to the history of anthropology and culture is the distinction he makes between the Jews and the other Semites, so that all the features of the so-called anti-Semitism are in fact directed only to the Jews, as a specific branch of the Semitic race, whom he describes as the most vicious minting of the entire Semitic race, and not to all the members of that race in general. The Jewish question, too, is not a religious one, but of the inherent and unchangeable character of the Jewish people. Thus, as he put it, it lies in the interest of a noble mankind, thus of a true humanity and culture, that this obscurantism of religion, which has up to now covered and protected the worst characteristics of the Jews with its darkness, be fully removed, so that the Jew may be revealed to us in his natural and inalienable constitution. The point of departure for Dühring's critique of the Jewry is thus an entirely moral one. The chief accusation against the Jews is that they are morally corrupt, and therefore thrive most in a society where moral corruption has already set in, or has begun to set in. This is the justification of the appellation of the Jewish race as a parasitical one, since it feeds on the moral corruption of the host society, a corruption either created by it, or if already present to some degree, fostered by it. The dangers of moral corruption through the admixture of Jews into European society have increased, particularly after the emancipation of the Jewry in the 60s and 70s of the last century. The source of the Jewish corrupt nature is located by Dühring in their basic lack of conscience and cruelty vis-à-vis the other nations. Exploitation of other nations is their major aim, and a genuine sense of human rights is utterly lacking in their commercial, essentially usurious dealings. This lack of a moral sense makes true politics impossible among them, and their involvement in all sorts of so-called socialist movements is only conditioned by their desire to extract advantages for themselves from disturbed social and economic conditions. The religious constitution of the Jews is evidenced most clearly in their overarching theocratic ideas of society, wherein the Jewish people are enslaved to their Lord God, but in turn must enslave the rest of mankind to please this sole jealous monarch of the world. Yahweh is indeed nothing but an embodiment of the Jewish self-interest, and represents the very opposite of the Indo-European natural pantheon. The Germanic mythology is ruled by concepts of fidelity and nature-bound spirituality, which have unfortunately been obscured by the overlaying of the original German moral character by Christianity, a religion which is very closely related to the Jewish racial culture in which it arose as a reaction to the evils of the Jewish nature. The Jewish religion has no truly religious character at all, but instead a markedly economic political one. Given their natural proclivity to profit-making, it's not surprising that the Jews have, in their extensive wanderings away from their homeland, curried favour with power holders in all ages through their financial loans. The Alliance Israélite Universelle, based in Paris, is in fact a modern confirmation of the operation of the political influence of Jews on an international scope under the cover of an apparently religious organization. The influence of the Jews on society is more evident in the upper and middle classes than in the lower, since the former are more exposed to the thoroughly Judaized press and literature of modern times. But the Jews themselves lack all cultural creative power, in science as well as in art, and merely trade in the ideas of others. The Jewish economist David Ricardo, from England, for example, derived his famous ground rent theory from the Scot James Anderson, and the Jewish mathematician Carl Gustav Jacobi, his ideas from the Norwegian Niels Abel. Even the sole distinguished philosopher of the Jewish race, Spinoza, has produced a system which is singularly lacking in all ideals above rational calculation. The neglect of compassion in his ethics as a feeling-based category to be overcome by the understanding points to the real cult of intellectual power which lies at the base of Spinoza's system. The Jewish talent in literature is always of a hybrid sort, displaying even amidst occasional attempts at Germanic sublimity an irresistible proclivity to buffoonery, as in the case of Heinrich Heine, and to polemics, as in the case of Ludwig Börne. The Jews lack all heroism of character to produce epic or dramatic literature, and can, at best, attain some weak lyricism, as revealed in their ancient psalms. Like Richard Wagner, Dühring also criticizes the unpleasant manner of Jewish chanting in the synagogues, and goes even farther than Wagner in his Anti-Judaism, in maintaining that Wagner himself compromised in the end with the Jews, in accepting generous donations from the Jews at Bayreuth, and in purporting to save those Jews who supported his music of the future, rather like a dispenser of indulgences. The general unsuitability of the Jews for artistic enterprise is in fact located by Dühring in their lack of what he calls that free and unselfish activity of the mind which alone advances to uninterested truth and beauty. The Judaized press, however, constantly ridicules the German nature as that of the simpleton, of the Deutschen Michael. In politics, the Jews have, through their involvement with the political parties of the present, corrupted the concepts of socialism and social democracy. Their aim in the realm of economics has been always, whether it be through Marx or through Lassalle, to foster economic dissatisfaction through terms such as class warfare, in order ultimately to achieve a merging of all nations into a Jewish kingdom. The German state was in fact founded originally on the moral quality of loyalty, fidelity, which was the basis of the feudal system, which developed therefrom in the Middle Ages. Loyalty should thus be the source of future German politics as well. The Jewish politics, on the other hand, is based on betrayal of Europeans as well as occasionally of Jews too by themselves. The intolerant Jewish ethos can operate only in an exploitative manner and under the enforcement of a terrorism learned from their fearful Lord God. True piety is lacking in their politics as much as in their religion. The Jewish infiltration into the legislative activities of the German state after the emancipation has enabled them to herd the German people under the thrall of individualistic freedom, so-called freedom, into the exploitative hands of the Jews. In this they have been abetted by the university professors and intelligentsia, since the latter depend for the most part on the Jewish press for their reputation. The advancement of Jews from an original pariah status to the leading political positions in the European nations is evidenced by the rise of Gambetta in France and of Disraeli in England. Gambetta rose to power on the basis of a French political fiasco for which his own people were responsible, the Dreyfus affair. Disraeli's opportunism is manifest in his use of the stock business to acquire foreign lands, particularly the Suez Canal. But the true manipulative schemes of the Jew are revealed by Disraeli himself in his fictional writings, such as Sybil, Tancred, and Coningsby. The very appointment of a Jew like Disraeli as the head of the English aristocracy is a sad sign of the degeneration of the English in recent times. Given the international nature of the Jewish problem, its solution, too, must be an international one, if it is to have any lasting effect. One of the major preparatory steps is the elimination of the false idea of tolerance. Tolerance of baseness is a contradiction of the principle of human tolerance itself. And I quote him, "Humane reciprocality will consist in living in peace insofar as the nobler humanity comes together in the good. For the rest, however, precisely battle and destruction will emerge so much more energetically against the inhuman." Similarly, the principle of equality cannot mean the consideration of that which is unequal as equal. The economic communes and corporations which Dühring suggests in his socialist system must therefore reserve the right to exclude harmful economic elements like the Jews. The specific means to be adopted against the Jews must be undertaken in three fields: the political, the economic, and the social. The political solution of the Jewish problem lies first in the spiritual emancipation of the people from their Jewish mentality and ethos. But individual natures are too weak to carry out this process of reformation of society by themselves, and so must be helped by the state legislations and administration. The disenfranchisement of the Jews is a sine qua non of all remedial action with regard to the Jewish problem. Their exclusion, internment, and deportation must be encouraged wherever possible. However, Dühring is too realistic to think that the creation of an independent Israeli state in Palestine and the deportation of the Jews to it would suffice to solve the Jewish problem. 4. The Jewish nature is an essentially nomadic one, and will soon disperse again throughout the world, even if it did manage to concentrate itself in Palestine for a while. The nomadic nature of the Jews itself is explained by Dühring as being due to the basically unpleasant nature of the Jews, so that they are repulsive even to themselves when they are alone with themselves, and not in the midst of Europeans, to whom they are naturally far more repugnant. Political representation and occupation of official positions by Jews is to be curtailed immediately in such a way that no Jew can be elected to Parliament any more than a Jew can exercise a right to vote in European elections. The excess number of Jewish judges must be reduced through forced retirement. The cost of retirement payments incurred hereby would be much less than the damages that are to be anticipated if the Jews continue to distort legislation and justice in the country over a long period of time. The financial measures to be adopted against the Jews should be directed by the knowledge that all Jewish racial economics is based on avarice and the ambition to dominate others. The powerful Jewish financial houses must be nationalized forthwith and placed under official curatorships and state supervision. This step must be carried out not only in Germany, but in every country where the Jews exert such financial power. The social means should at first be focused on the chief Jewish agent of social influence, the press, wherewith the Jews turn public opinion into Jewish opinion. Jews must be removed from all ownership as well as editorial positions of newspapers, though for the cultivation of a public opinion different from the present predominantly Jewish liberal one, radical political changes are necessary as well. Education, too, should be reoriented in a native Germanic way by the exclusion of Jews from school and university instructorships. If the Jews have succeeded so far in their social endeavours, it is precisely because the university professors have, in their weakness and corruption, encouraged the parasitical activity of the Jews. Other important social means against the Jews consist in the discouragement of intermarriages between Germans and Jews. He rightly points out that the case where a Jewish woman marries a German man is somewhat better than the reverse, since the man is the bearer of the inherited spiritual qualities. The state's role in anti-Jewish measures must be supplemented by agitations on the part of the people. The parties themselves are impotent in their narrow programs and have too much connection to Jewish agencies to be effective in any way. The Jewish question is first and last a moral question, and demands the re-establishment of German loyalty and trust against the frivolity of the Jewish mind and the corruption that creeps under cover of this frivolity. What is at stake is the very existence, moral and material, of the European peoples. For, as he says, if things are not directed, the descendants of traders in old wardrobes and scraps and cattle bones must get to the very bones of the modern peoples after they have pocketed their wealth and lamed their mind through inoculation. Dühring's teachings were a major source of the developing doctrines of National Socialists in Germany and Austria. One of the earliest admirers of Dühring's economic doctrines was the German social democratic leader, in fact, August Bebel, who described Dühring's latest economic work as belonging to the best which the most recent period has brought forth in the economic field. In 1878, Wilhelm Liebknecht, the Jewish socialist, however, warned Marx and Engels of Dühring's anti-Marxist economic views, and thereby encouraged Engels to issue a refutation of Dühring's doctrines in a work entitled Herr Dührings Umwälzung der Wissenschaft, also called in short Anti-Judaism. In response, Dühring reiterated his criticisms of Marx and Lassalle as the Jewish perverters of true socialist doctrine. Like Werner Sombart after him, Dühring maintained that Marx had derived his theories partly from the Mosaic teachings and formed his international plan as a variant of the Alliance Israelite. Among the racialistic nationalists who came under Dühring's influence, we may mention the German nationalists in Czechoslovakia, Hans Krebs and Rudolf Jung, who were important figures in the National Socialist movement in the Sudetenland. The most important of the Austrian nationalists who came under the influence of Dühring was Georg Ritter von Schönerer, who spearheaded the nationalist movement in Austria, which was to be the nurturing ground for Hitler's ideology. Dühring's influence on Schönerer's anti-Semitism, which was established through the latter's university contacts, is revealed in the doctrinal stance that the latter took at the Deutsche Club in 1887, the way he declared, "We make no secret of regarding anti-Semitism not as a regrettable symptom or disgrace, but as the main prop of national thought, the chief means of promoting a disposition genuinely based on the people, and thus the greatest achievement of the century." Schönerer's pan-German movement was outlined in the Linz program, published in 1882, which included 11 points of economic and political measures to be taken to strengthen German unity. To these points, a 12th was added in 1885, stating that the removal of Jewish influences from all sections of public life is indispensable for carrying out the reforms aimed at. Schönerer's pan-Germanism was not quite successful, since it did not have the support of the peasants and the factory workers, or of the aristocrats and the big industrialists. For the most part, it was a middle and lower middle class movement. However, the tenacity of Schönerer's pan-Germanist movement is revealed in the fact that soon after the disintegration of his own party, there was formed the new German Nationalist Party, the Deutsche Arbeiter Party, in 1903, which in turn was the forerunner of the Deutsche Nationalsozialistische Arbeiter Party of Austria. The social effect of Dühring's work can be estimated more generally in the anti-Jewish congresses organized first at Dresden in 1882 and then at Chemnitz in 1883. At the latter, a division occurred on account of the ideological differences between those who favored Dühring's more uncompromising views and the Christian elements at the meeting. However, a loose confederation of Reformvereine sprang up in the 1880s, and by 1890 there was about a group of 136 Reformvereine. As Peter Pulzer reports, the extreme view associated with Dühring predominated in Westphalia under the leadership of Dr. Koenig, while the state social legislation of Bismarck served to allay the enthusiasm regarding the Jewish problem somewhat and to disintegrate these anti-Jewish organizations. The movement acquired a new impetus from the leadership of Theodor Fritsch in Leipzig, who revitalized it according to the extremist point of view. It was Fritsch's call for an anti-Jewish organization above the parties which created such seminal nationalist socialist parties as the Thule Society and the Germanen Order. It's true that the latter were in fact not so directly influential on the National Socialist Party itself, which, though initially created by Karl Harrer, along with Anton Drexler, at the suggestion of the Germanen Order that several economic rings of the society should be set up all over the country, ultimately prescribed the Germanen Order for its overly Masonic qualities. Even Hitler does not refer to Dühring in his works, and was more familiar, even personally, with Houston Stewart Chamberlain's racialism. However, even if it may not have had a direct political connection with the establishment of the Nazi movement, the extraordinary intellectual value of Dühring's work on the Jews consists in its prophetic accuracy. Dühring's systematic uncovering of the viciousness of the Jewish character and his suggestions for the removal of this evil bear the closest resemblance to the increasing anti-Semitic mood, ideological as well as popular, and the actual course of anti-Semitic events in Germany in the 30s and 40s. Starting with the measures to exclude Jews from official positions and the prohibition of intermarriages between Jews and Germans promulgated in the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, and ending with increasing irritation with the very presence of Jews on German soil, the anti-Judaic programs of the Nazis were anticipated almost to the last detail by the blind philosopher of Berlin. Between the first appearance of Dühring's work and the first major political mass measures taken against the Jews by the National Socialist regime, there had elapsed a rather long period of about 60 years. Neither Jews nor Jewish sympathizers can blame the Germans for having been too rash in their dealings with a racial group whose social and cultural influence had been philosophically identified as morally criminal. The claims of Jewish historians like George Mosse and Donald Niewig, that the brutalization of German politics was spurred by the defeat of 1918 is only partially accurate, since the sharp turn of anti-Semitic trends in the Weimar Republic was actually propelled by the blatant arrogation of power by those very Jewish elements whom intellectual anti-Semites 30 years before the start of the First World War had sought to expel from German society through kinder means. The moral corruption associated with Jewish finance and customs showed no signs of improving since the first publication of Dühring's work, but rather achieved a giddy triumph at the end of the First World War in the ill-fated Weimar Republic, which was initially established as a socialist republic by Karl Liebknecht, the Jewish agitator, and conducted in a markedly Jewish social and political climate. It cannot be very surprising to one who is familiar with Dühring's analysis of the Jewish ethos and its role in modern Germany that the Germans reacted to this ethos with a nationalist movement such as Hitler's. Those sections of the population which suffered most from the sense of exploitation at the hands of the Jewish economic and social system naturally supported a German nationalist movement, which sought in the end to destroy the Jewish evil at its very roots. As Dühring had foretold, I quote him, "The German, to be sure, moves his limbs mostly only when the usurpations become too malicious. But if he does that once, then he does that which he undertakes, no matter what, also in a fundamental way." Indeed, the similarities that Hitler's Mein Kampf bears to the moral underpinnings of Dühring's doctrines are of extreme significance. We note, for instance, that Hitler too recognizes that it's precisely in the matter of the development of the human personality that the German is most distinguished from the Jew. And I quote Mein Kampf, "The destructive workings of Judaism in different parts of the national body can be ascribed fundamentally to the persistent Jewish efforts at undermining the importance of personality among the nations that are their hosts, and in place of personality substituting the domination of the masses. The constructive principle of Aryan humanity is thus displaced by the destructive principle of the Jews. They become the ferment of decomposition among nations and races, and in a broad sense the wreckers of human civilization. This is most evident in the economically oriented communism of the Jew Marx." And I quote Mein Kampf again, "Marxism represents the most striking phase of the Jewish endeavor to eliminate the dominant significance of personality in every sphere of human life and replace it by the numerical power of the masses. In politics, the parliamentary form of government is the expression of this effort. In the field of economics, we see the trade union movement, which does not serve the real interests of the employees, but the destructive aims of the international Jewry. Just to the same degree in which the principle of personality is excluded from the economic life of the nation, and the influence and activities of the masses substituted in its stead, national economy, which should be for the service and benefit of the community as a whole, will gradually deteriorate in its creative capacity." Hitler therefore stresses the importance of strengthening the German state itself through its domestic policy as a prerequisite for the successful execution of international designs. Like Dühring, Hitler points to the need of a sound moral culture of the youth, in such a way that the goal of education is declared to be a heightening of their sense of race and of the importance of its preservation. The educational system, according to Hitler, will include a strong physical culture for the boys, so that softness does not force them into the deleterious byways of the sexual subculture of the metropolises. The basis of a sound education for the youth is the family, and schools must be oriented not to the cramming of information, but to the development of willpower and the sense of responsibility. Marriages must be re-emphasized as a means to the propagation and preservation of the species and the race. Prostitution must be fought by the encouragement of early marriages, especially for the man. Women in general are considered only as state subjects until they are married, when they will attain the status of state citizens. State citizenship is granted only to German men who have undergone the military service and sworn allegiance to the national community. The decay of morals must be stopped forthwith, and therefore Hitler proposes a cleaning up of our culture. And I quote him, "Theatre, art, literature, movies, the press, bill posters and window displays must be cleaned of the symptoms of a rotting world and put into the service of a model idea of state and culture." This comment is hardly surprising in the light of the Jewish-dominated culture of the golden 20s of the Weimar Republic. Hitler even anticipates, as it were, any reproach of populist tactics in social reordering with the remark that a man who knows a thing, who realizes a given danger, and who sees with his eyes the possibility of a remedy, has the damned duty and obligation to work, not in silence, but to stand up publicly against the evil and for its remedy. In retrospect, therefore, we may consider the Nazi movement as being in no way an aberration, but one which was clearly predicted in advance by philosophical understanding. Historical discussions of Hitler's regime, which puzzle over the extreme measures taken by it against the Jews and Jewish Bolshevism, and quickly dismiss it as the product of the monstrous psychological complexes of one or two individuals, are clearly handicapped by their unfamiliarity with the real philosophical impetuses of an ideological political movement such as the Nazi. Peter Pulser's suggestion that Hitler was merely relying on the political effectiveness of anti-Semitism, for instance, seems not to understand that anti-Semitism was in its origins and throughout its career in the early years of the century not a mere tool in German politics, except perhaps in the case of Bismarck, but the very aim of it. The Nazi phenomenon, therefore, is not a passing one which the German people have or could successfully overcome with the defeat of Hitler's regime at the end of the Second World War. It is the populist nemesis which will inevitably set in when necessary steps are not taken at an earlier stage by genuine conservative and socialist politicians against the disintegration of European society by the Jews. The failure of the Nazis may have been partly due to their rashness in foreign policy. The powerful influence of the Jewish presence in America and Britain was not reckoned with adequately to forestall the defeat at the hands of the Allies. But the real tragedy of the Second World War is that the failure of the Nazi movement, as well as the post-war propaganda of the Nazi attempts to eliminate the Jewry in Germany, has only succeeded in handing over the sympathy of the public to the very elements which formed the pivotal issue of the war. The corruption and degeneration that Dühring and the Nazis attempted to check have proceeded with redoubled vigour after the war, and the enslavement of the European peoples to the Jewish baseness and vulgarity has become almost complete. The danger of another reprisal against the Jews is therefore greater now than 50 years ago. The lesson to be drawn from our study of Dühring's prophetic philosophical work on the Jewish character can thus be only a cautionary one, for the conditions of Jewish mastery of society today are clearly more predominant at the turn of this century than they were at the end of the last. If the Jews do not voluntarily agree to such restrictions of their influence on European society and culture as Dühring suggested in the earlier editions of his Judenfrage, and I wonder if they ever would, it is fully within the realm of possibility that they will expose themselves once again to the revenge of the masses, that is now both the middle and working classes, when the latter are awakened to the exploitation, intellectual as well as material, that they inevitably suffer from the Jewish financial manipulations. If the steps suggested from a genuinely European conservative and socialist standpoint are not followed, then the only alternative that the Jews will face will be the more drastic steps favoured by demagogues, who may find in Dühring's final solution of the Jewish problem a more lasting remedy for the problem of social exploitation by middlemen. The steps suggested by Dühring in the first editions of the Judenfrage may thus serve as a guideline to more reasonable conservative and nationalistic politicians for the task of social reformation. The chief organs of Jewish finance, the presses, must be de-Judaized as completely as possible, and the media likewise. The most important socio-economic transformation will be the replacement of the Jewish capitalist institutions by more corporative ones which do not contain Jewish elements in them. Corporatism, as it is found in the present-day liberal economies, especially in Austria, Norway, Sweden and the Netherlands, is still one ruled by the economists and not by the sense of social coherence, which is the genuine basis of corporatism. The reorganization of corporatism in European and American economy would have to involve the state somewhat more closely, as a mediator of semi-autonomous economic units, if not as a centralistic economic director. The representation of the needs and duties of the public in the political process must also be conducted not through political parties serving commercial interests, but through the cooperative framework itself. The distribution of property, as in German socialism, as in true conservatism, should be directly related to the talent and capacity of the individual holding it, and not dependent on the unthinking vagaries of capitalist fortune or the senseless sharing and equal distribution of property of a communist society. All economics finally should be subservient to political morality, wherein the individual self-interest is dominated by the sense of commitment to the community. In this context, the neo-Proudhonian project of a federalistic reorganization of Europe according to ethnies, or the linguistic and cultural individuality of European groups, I may mention, points the way to the future exclusion of the Jews, who come under the category of those who, and I quote authority on federalism, despite linguistic and cultural independence, have no or only an insufficient national awareness from the social and political affairs of the European peoples. In the final analysis, the most important and permanent changes in human society, as Dühring insisted, are those that arise from the inward reformation of the individuals constituting it. The sense of loyalty and honesty and duty that are the hallmarks of the Indo-European character must therefore direct the reorganization of society in such a way that not the least scope is given to the Jewish profiteering mentality to thrive in its midst once again. In other words, the Indo-European must become conscious once again of the distinction of his spiritual and moral constitution as opposed to the stunted mentality of the Jew, and consciously avoid it.